witaudio.org.nz.
Hello, my name is Simon. Welcome to Why Is That, a free speech platform where we explore big ideas and the controversies of our time. Hello, beloveds, and welcome back to another episode of Why Is That. I hope you had a good Christmas break. A lot of people talk about society and talk about mental health separately. Why is that? Today in the studio we've got Sheldon Brown, another radio host from Planet FM, who's had his show for 23 years on mental illness. Hello, Sheldon.
How are you, Simon?
Can you tell me a bit about the work you do?
Well, the radio show, Mental Health Radio, Take It From Us, has been running 23 years. We're going to celebrate 25 in April 2018. We were funded by the Like Minds, Like Mine campaign for a long period of time, and that campaign addresses the stigma and discrimination that exists towards people who have mental health issues. So when you say that there's a divide between society and mental health, I think you said, one of the reasons is because of that stigma and discrimination.
Yeah, because mental health is often viewed as something internal to the individual rather than an interplay with society. But in recent times, I've seen more of a acceptance from society with people with things like depression and anxiety and things like that.
Well, I think depression and anxiety are such prevalent illnesses. I think depression is going to become the world's most common illness probably in the next 2 or 3 years. So I think there's a demand to do something about that, to address it, because the cost to countries, to New Zealand, is quite astronomical in terms of people not being able to go to work, people probably having to capitalise and access mental health services. And, you know, the mental health industry is a $1.4 billion industry in New Zealand. That's how much we spend on mental health, either hospitals or most of it now in the community.
I have noticed generally in society and in culture and even in politics, the view of everything is getting really dark. It's not like, yes, we're going to this bright future, etc. But I suppose there are progressives that are like, yeah, bright future, but our current situation is a bit, we've got all this horrible stuff going in society. It does seem, the brightness is going away.
Well, it's a bit ironic that you talk about brightness going away at a time when we're supposed to be very bright and joyful. I guess for those people with mental health challenges, this is a very challenging time of the year. And they may have limited budgets, they may be on benefits, they may be deprived of the chance to go to caring places, creative places over the holidays, because these places close down. So it is a time of great vulnerability for those people with mental health issues. And I think if we feel a bit isolated during the year, that intensifies when we think that everybody's gone to the beach and are having a wonderful time and surrounded by family and friends.
Because you see... well, they call it Facebook depression, where people just look at Facebook and how, everyone's living these wonderful lives where, I remember being told a story about a girl who went to holiday in Thailand and she hated it, but she was doing all these selfies that looked like she was having a great time and, and her friends are going, I'm so jealous. But, it's perception can play a huge role in mental illness.
Well, I think the British Mental Health Foundation have got a campaign going on at the moment called I'm Fine. And Coast Radio was talking about this, and the fact that when we ask somebody how they are, we expect them to say, well, I'm fine. We don't expect them to say, well, look, I'm actually feeling very, very depressed. I've just come out of a respite centre where I've been for 3 days and I've lost my job and I haven't got any money. Then then we have the sort of embarrassing sort of situation. Well, how do you respond to that? So it's so much easier for people to just say, oh, I'm fine. And I think Kiwis have that expectation that they're going to receive that response. But when do we actually scrape the surface and get into nitty-gritty discussions about our vulnerability?
I think you touched on a good point, about how we don't want to deal with negative things anymore. That's why going, oh, I'm having a bad day. People are like, oh, this is negativity, it's bringing me down, where it has... Yeah, just people don't seem to be real, this is where I am, this is, even to close friends and family.
Well, the stats suggest that, New Zealand is not socially a very healthy country to live in. We have a very, very high suicide rate. I think the latest unofficial figures are something like 580 people in New Zealand committed suicide. I've just been talking on my mental health radio show about specialist mental health and addiction services. There were over 160,000 people last year that accessed those services, and that's a record. So these, the number of people wanting help for mental health and addictions is rising. What we don't seem to want to address is why there are these social issues.
Yes, it's hard to pinpoint when we started on this trajectory, isn't it?
Well, I think we started on it from the time that the national government took power. And for any government to say that there isn't a housing crisis in Auckland and to really negate the realities of what is happening in housing in Auckland and the social ramifications of that, the pressure that it is putting on middle income people, but more so the lower income.
I think generally in society, a lot of social issues, whether on the left or right, people we're not recognizing the reality of what's going on, because like my generation, there seems to be no chance of home ownership. A lot of my friends who are professionals, moved out to the extremes of Auckland and, to get cheap places. But, the generation coming before, and of course that's got to take a toll on mental health.
Yeah, well, I've been privileged to have got into home ownership at the age of 18. I've owned probably 10 or 11 houses in my life. And I have seen in, 60 years, it go from I could buy a house at the age of 18 for, say, £9,000, $18,000. Today, you can't buy anything for almost less than $1 million. There isn't a cheap house in Auckland. And, I think even in those outer suburbs, they were saying the other day that 600,000 is what you're going to need. Well, unless you've got a rich parents who can stump up with the $150,000 deposit, it's pretty hard to get started.
Well, this touches on an interesting topic about how much of mental health is natural and how much is it from the environment? I suppose nature versus nurture.
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, Simon. I'm somebody with who's had some experience, personal experience with depression and anxiety, and I guess that's the reason that I ended up working for a community mental health organisation. When I say to people that I host a mental health radio show, they say to me, "Oh, are you a psychiatrist?" I don't know that I can answer the question about how much is environment and how much, if you like, is inherited. But they do say that you've got about a 15 to 20% chance of inheriting a mental health challenge, either from parents or from grandparents. My feeling is that it's the pressure of life, the competitiveness of life, and, housing is a great example, that is increasing the stress, increasing the likelihood of depression. And, I think that it's very important for all of us to put some sort of natural therapy in place to look out for ourselves.
And, that can be on many levels. That means we're not eating well, are we? Because when you're saying mental health is, depression is going to be one of the top things, it's like diabetes is probably also going to be up there. And that also interplays. If you're not feeling well, if you're not keeping healthy, or you do have chronic illnesses, that has an exponential effect.
Well, I have a personal example of that in that the co-host of the mental health radio show, Take It From Us, he has diabetes. He got a very serious tooth poisoned, and he ended up in the acute unit at City Hospital, and his diabetes was a major complaint. So we talk about this sort of interplay between our physical health and our mental health, and they are both so closely interlinked. We can't separate one from the other. And so having a good diet, eating well, eating our 5 fresh vegetables and fruit every day, exercising, going for a walk, getting plenty of sunshine, maybe taking some vitamins, drinking lots of water. All those things are wellness strategies that we really need to put in play every day.
And I also think, green time instead of screen time.
Right.
Getting out in nature. Because going back to the housing thing, they're talking about in Auckland, which the house prices are horrific. These high density, massive apartment complex they want to build. I can't imagine that is good for people's mental health.
Well, I don't know that Kiwis have really are going to adapt to high-rise living in small apartments with 1 or maybe 1.5 bedrooms, no garden. I mean, we've been used to the quarter-acre Pavlova paradise, haven't we? So it's going to be a huge culture shock to go from the Pavlova paradise to 60 square metres or whatever it is. On the 18th floor in the central city.
Which isn't the Kiwis' native environment.
No, the Kiwis don't. They're much better in the bush.
Yes. I know friends of mine who, they've left New Zealand, they've gone overseas, but, they're, they got, how we say, depressed about immigration, I suppose, because, in their fields they had to compete with so many people just coming in from overseas. And, they're quite, common roles, not anything specialist we don't have already. And I noticed there are social pressures being created by immigration.
Well, I guess my view on immigration is that it has created a great diversity in New Zealand, and particularly in a city like Auckland. And if you go to any of the Auckland Council-sponsored events, I went to the annual celebration of roses at the Rose Garden in Parnell. The people who respond to those things today are the Indians, the Asians, the Chinese, the Middle Easterns, and it has changed the whole landscape, the sort of human landscape of New Zealand. Yes, it's created a lot more competition, but I think that maybe we needed competition in New Zealand. I think that, we were a little bit laid back, too laid back about our work ethic. And I think that maybe some of these cultures have given us a bit of a rev-up.
Oh, there's definitely pros and cons. I'm just thinking of the, I don't expect anyone when I say this to, recognise it, the Putnam study that was on diversity. They talked about sort of how multiculturalism can break down civil society, well, social society. And, we see community groups don't do as well as they used to. Things like Scouts and just neighbourhood organisations. These things come in waves, etc. But we don't seem to have as strong a community as we used to. Engagement.
Well, I think that's one of the causes of this increase in people accessing mental health services. We are becoming much more isolated. I think our cell phones are probably one of the key factors for isolation. I mean, I watch out my window most mornings when I'm getting dressed, and all I see are people walking down the road with their cell phone in front of them. Well, it makes them very unavailable. And we have this phenomenon where couples go out for dinner and they're both seen on their cell phone. They're not communicating at all. It means, I think, that people are unavailable.
Because they did a brilliant study about, it was called Bowling Alone. When we were at university, it was bandied around, a lot, about how personalised things like PlayStations and that have taken away from things like, since it's an American study, bowling leagues, etc. So there's not a whole big social bowling thing. You're bowling alone,
right?
So there is that isolation because it does give, electronic devices we've got, do provide a certain amount of entertainment and that, but it's no substitute for human contact, is it?
Well, I think isolation, to me, my view is that isolation is the worst possible thing for one's mental health. And I think that we can start catastrophizing, we can start assuming things, we can start to think we have no friends, we have no social contact, we're a failure, we're a loser, and those sorts of thoughts can take us down a very nasty downward spiral, which can jeopardise our mental and physical health. So to me, isolation is probably one of the worst ways to flourish and to stay well.
Because if you look at in prisons with solitary confinement, the mental health, it really is cruel and unusual punishment. But you see people in wider society with the same symptoms because, they feel cut off as well.
Well, I live in a complex of 25 apartments and I've been there 14 years. I guess I know why there isn't a lot of social contact, because these apartment complexes seem to attract some of the looniest of people. So there's no desire for me or incentive to communicate or socialise with these people. But I would have thought that a complex of 25 apartments would have been a natural community, but that's not happening. And, I think this lack of connection and the lack of community is something that really needs to be addressed at national level.
Could you talk a bit about, because I'm just thinking as the flow of the conversation, about change, and I find a lot of people's, they're having problems with self-identity, you know what I mean? They don't know where they fit in.
Well, maybe that's a reflection of their lack of self-awareness, their inability to communicate effectively. I guess I have a strong view that Kiwis are somewhat insecure. And that insecurity leads to the need for things like drugs and alcohol to boost their confidence and to boost their ability to connect. I mean, it fascinates me when you go to somebody's wedding and you may not know anybody there, and everybody's standing around waiting for the ceremony to start, and nobody makes an approach to chat. You know, I mean, just a natural question would be, well, who do you know here today? Do you know the bride and groom, or do you know the family? You know, I mean, but nobody does that. Nobody makes that initial connection, and we seem to have an inability to break the ice.
Yeah, well, we met at the Stations Awards thing where I just came up to you. It's like, hi. Because New Zealanders, it's surprising because New Zealanders are huge ones for small talk. You know, it's like, how about that weather?
Right, well, the rugby.
But also for drinking. So, huge drinking culture around social. In fact, I don't think a lot of people can be social without alcohol. The social lubrication.
Well, right, and then the implications of that for mental health. I mean, I think either alcohol or drugs, neither of them are helpful for good mental health. And I've interviewed so many people who have dabbled in marijuana initially, then they've got pretty well hooked on it, and their mental health has deteriorated very rapidly.
It does seem to be it does erode mental health, excessive drinking and drug use, doesn't it?
It does erode your mental health.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, ask anybody who's got a hangover how their mental health is.
I mean, some people do dispute that, the talks about legalization of marijuana. I know many of my peers who, when they were younger, were potheads, and that they haven't, because one of the things of drug use is you don't grow emotionally, you sort of stunted, and they're at that stage, they're perpetual teenagers, it seems, but it's, and that has affected them in life. They're frustrated, they can't adapt to a more adult society.
Well, and has their, cognitive ability, their brain power, they killed off a few of the old brain cells? I don't know. I mean, I think we can't generalise on these things, but generally I think we're dicing with death a little bit in terms of if we want to have good mental health, using what do we call it, self-medicating. In mental health circles we talk about self-medicating. So it's either alcohol to make us feel better, but in my experience alcohol is not a great antidepressant.
It's sort of like somebody's identified a problem and they're using a crutch.
Well, very much so. And again, I mean, isn't it representative of rather than seeking help and addressing the problem and coming out, if you like, just like if we have a sexual difference, we come out and declare it, but do we come out and declare that we are depressed or very anxious or vulnerable and we need help, and ask people where we can get that help?
Because it is viewed as a weakness, and a lot of people want to appear healthy, but they're not, and they're not going to get healthy without admitting it, are they?
No, they're not going to get healthy without admitting it, and I think the first place to go is to your GP and to be open and honest. And the John Kirwan depression campaign has probably done a great deal to open the doors and to gain acceptance for particularly blokes to address the issue of depression. I mean, we've got over 600,000 people in New Zealand on antidepressants.
It's a staggering number, isn't it? I mean, we still have, if not the highest, one of the highest youth suicide rates. And men's suicide rates, especially, is 3 times the rate of women. But we don't talk about it, partially because men don't want to talk about it.
Well, if I introduce these sorts of subjects at my tennis club, which is rated as sort of up there, I suppose, people look at me and they don't want their bubble pierced in any way. They don't want to know, and I think we are pushing a whole lot of these sorts of things like abuse and bullying and the suicide rate and the amount of antidepressants that are consumed in New Zealand. We're sweeping it under the carpet.
Yes, they're not popular party topics, are they?
No, well, yeah, just if you want to be stigmatised at a party, just mention mental health.
So, in the last 5 minutes, what would you say if somebody feels they've got mental health issues, etc., including depression, anxiety, what steps should they take? Well,
I think the first step is to go and see their GP, and the GP may refer them to a community mental health centre or to a counsellor, or they're now called talking therapists, Simon. There's a new campaign to try and get talking therapy introduced more widely at a very economic rate, because we do have a cost reality in this, and so many of the people who may be vulnerable to mental health cannot afford to pay for talking therapies or counselling or a psychologist. So we're reliant on GP practices to provide maybe 4 sessions or 6 sessions for nothing. Is that enough if you've got a serious depressive illness or anxiety? All I can recommend is mindfulness, and this has been a lifesaver for me. Living in the now, having a presence of mind, not worrying about the future or the past, and doing some little exercises to continue to just be in the present.
Yeah, because we were talking about before about how change can affect people's, but also a change can be good. If you move to somewhere completely different, that can be a fresh start, which you might need.
Well, as long as it's not Huntley or Narrawahia, I think it might be a good idea.
Oh yeah, it's a nice place.
Oh, right.
Is there anything you would say specifically to avoid besides drugs and alcohol?
I think, probably constant partying. We're talking about the party season. I think the important thing is to try and maintain some balance, and that includes, one's diet, one's exercise. Maintain the routine. And don't mix with toxic people who are negative.
Oh, well, that's one of the things I want to touch on, because I noticed a whole lot of people in bad relationships, shall we say, somebody I know, his partner went off at him for an hour, and it's just, that's not a healthy relationship. Relationship's now ended, thankfully. But, it's also people around you, isn't it? The support network. And sometimes it's just counterproductive if you don't have good people around you.
Well, try and cultivate positive people, people that are optimistic, people that are living in the now rather than worried about what might happen in the future, and people that have similar interests to yourself, so that, and I guess, cultivate people if you do feel a vulnerability to depression and anxiety or more serious mental health issues. Try and identify somebody who is compassionate and empathetic to mental health, who you can talk to.
Very good advice.
Well, I don't call it advice, but just...
after 22 years, you pick up a whole lot of things. 23 years, sorry.
Well, not 23 years on hosting this radio show, just 8 years, but a fair track record in my own personal experience of mental health.
Well, it can also be important for institutions, because some community groups haven't been going that long, have they? Institutional knowledge is quite a good thing.
Yeah, well, I guess you'd call it intellectual property.
Okay, we'll begin to wrap it up. So, Sheldon, can you please tell people where they can find you?
Oh, well, you could reach me at Framework, which is a community mental health centre, 523-2790, or you could ring me on mobile 021-976-564.
And of course, you can find his show on Planet FM. Go and check out the website, and we're about to have a brand new one, and a whole lot of other shows.
Yeah, planetaudio.org.nz /take it from us.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheldon.
My pleasure.